Hello, everyone. This is Seth Dellinger, and this is the Meaningful Movement podcast. And I'm here with Lara Heppell, and she is a yoga teacher, also a trainer of other yoga teachers, a doula, and her emphasis in her yoga teaching is on working with women, especially through the whole journey of womanhood, which she's going to explain more in depth what that journey is about for us. And she really has that emphasis in her work, which I guess, and we'll talk about this too, is different than maybe where you started, but really a somatic and a therapeutic approach. And you have been in the UK, but actually now you're in France. Where are you in France?
I'm in a little village called La Roque des Albert, which is southwest France near Perpignan.
Okay, so your family just moved there. Well, I thought I would start by asking you about the moon. Because I was reading a blog of yours, and one of the things that you have really specialized is with working with women around the menstrual cycle. And I guess people, especially I always have to sort of think about this as like, well, for me, how often do I think about that? How much do most men think about that? Probably very little. But I think people know that there is some sort of connection between the menstrual cycle and the cycling of the moon. But what you wrote about there is, of course, that idea is not so present in the modern world. This is an older idea. Anyway, there's a number of different things about that blog post that were kind of fascinating to me, but maybe I'll just stop here and let you give a bit of an introduction. What's that connection all about?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of separate the two things out. Because women by nature are cyclical beings. Okay, so that's like one thing. And with a menstrual cycle, that's kind of what makes us cyclical. We can't be the same every day of the month because we go through like different energy shifts. Everybody does. Women's are a bit more predictable though, I would say, than men's because of the cycle of the menstrual cycle. And then within the menstrual cycle, there's also the element of how the moon interacts with that. So there's kind of your own individual unique cycle that's going on with the menstrual cycle. And then within that also coexists with what's happening with the moon. So I'm going to talk about a woman's menstrual cycle first. So basically every month when women are cycling and when they're in like perimenopause or menopause, this starts to change. And women start more and more just to cycle with like the seasons around them and the moon itself. Okay, so when each month a woman goes through 4 phases of energy, and in the way that I was taught by the amazing Alexandra Pope and Uma Dinsmore-Toohey, these are referred to as seasons. So we've got spring, summer, autumn, and winter. So spring is like your pre-ovulation time, and it's like the season of spring for a woman. It's like everything's fresh and new, and she's kind of like, oh yeah, what am I going to do this month? And then we go into summer, which is where there's like loads of estrogen. We can make a baby. We feel really sexy. We're in superwoman territory. We can do loads of stuff. So that might be when we've got more energy to do more physical movement. Everyone loves us in summer. Everyone wants us to stay in that place where we can do everything and multitask. Then we come down from the high of summer into autumn, and it's very much like autumn. We start to come into ourselves, progesterone levels are rising. We want to kind of do a bit less, there's a bit more introspection. And then winter is your like bleed time, which is like winter. really we want to be on our own. Years ago, women used to go to a red tent and gather together and leave the kids at home, and they would bleed together and be together and rest. So these are the natural cycles of like that a woman goes through every month. And then years ago, that most women would bleed with the new moon, which is the dark moon, because there wasn't electricity and all that kind of stuff. So you know, they bleed with the dark moon, and they would ovulate with the full moon, which is that kind of natural cycle that mimics the menstrual cycle that's going on with the moon all the time. Yeah. But now sometimes you might have women doing things the other way around. So they might be bleeding with the full moon and ovulating with the new moon. And often that's known as a particular type of cycle, which is sort of, if you've got gifts that you're giving out to the world, then there's this sort of theory that you would bleed with the full moon and ovulate with the new moon. So there's like a red moon cycle and a white moon cycle, and generally we'll be in one or the other, or we might be in between, sort of halfway, you know, not bleeding with the full or new moon. So that's the kind of theory around the moon. And then as women move out of the menstrual cycling years, what I hear, because I'm sort of on the cusp of that now, is that more and more that full moon becomes their new ovulation time, and their new moon becomes their new bleed time, even though they're not having a menstrual cycle anymore.
So I never heard this before. That, I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense. There's so much about the modern world that, you know, the environment has been reconstructed in every way, you know, just the fact that you and I can be sitting in front of computers and talking like this. But the idea that in the past, most women would essentially have the same cycle, like they could, as I understand it from you, two women could just meet and almost assume you're probably experiencing something similar to what I am right now.
Yeah.
You're not looking to replicate that now. You're not looking to sort of realign, or is that part of what you?
No, some people do work on that basis, trying to get the cycle to realign with the, you know, moon, with the new moon or what have you. But what I've come to find is that actually, I think often your cycle changes for different reasons. So there might be times in your life when actually you need more energy when you're bleeding. And often for me, that is, you know, when my cycle changes. So for me, what I've found is that in the spring and summer, I bleed with the new moon, and in the autumn and winter, I bleed with the full moon. And my cycle changes at the equinoxes. So because I've charted this over years, I know this information about myself. So every equinox, so like autumn equinox, a few months before that, my cycle will start to change each month by a few days, and then it shifts into that change for the autumn and winter. And it kind of feels to me like that's my body kind of changing things, so that because I work a lot with people, I have a bit more energy in the autumn and winter, when naturally all the seasons around me, everything's slowing down. So I kind of view it now as I think that whatever your cycle is for you, then there's normally a reason that it's that way. That's kind of my view. But
So when you say you charted it, it's like you literally plotted out the cycles of the moon and then plotted out your cycles, and you're kind of saying,
yeah, so
where did they come together?
Yeah, I have this a big part of what I do actually is teaching women to do cycle charting, menstrual cycle charting. So what that means is, and I like to do mine on paper. I've got this amazing diary that I use. So every day, just checking in with yourself. How do I feel emotionally, physically? What's my energy like? What are my needs? And you do that over a long time. So you start to get a picture of kind of what spring, summer, autumn, winter is like for you each month, and then what you need in each month. So then that charting becomes like a self-care tool for life, and it helps you look after yourself better. It also helps you know yourself better. So what I know is day 26 roughly every month before my bleed comes, I have a massive meltdown day. But what I know is that I have that every month. So now I can prepare for it, and I make sure I don't see many people on that day. I don't book in many clients. I give myself space. So we can use this knowledge to plan out our diary so that we can kind of do interviews and things like that, maybe when we're more in spring and summer. We can use our cyclical nature to use the gifts and superpowers that we get at each part of our cycle to help us be more productive actually in life.
Yeah, I wish I could know how I was going to feel tomorrow morning. I don't seem to have that.
But there's always going to be curveballs that come as well. So you can like map something out, and then like you start going into perimenopause where everything just changes and you like try and plan it, but it's all gone haywire. So it's kind of like a tool. It doesn't always work 100%, but the more we start doing it from an earlier age as well, the more helpful it becomes when we move into perimenopause and menopause, because the woman that we are in autumn and winter is the woman that we become all the time in perimenopause and menopause, because we don't have estrogen anymore. So the spring and summer woman and that energy that we had, or what she was like, she's not there so much. So when we chart for, you know, quite a few years and we really get into it and we know ourselves, then when changes happen, there's kind of a bit of ground that we can hold on to and remember and work with.
So, excuse me, when I was reading the blog, you know, it also passed through my mind, I wonder how many guys read this blog post. Probably not a lot, right? But, you know, I think for men who don't experience any of this, right, and they hear some of this discussion and then they hear the inclusion of the moon, and I'm sure you've run into this, that I'm sure there's a lot of guys who are maybe rolling their eyes or saying like, how can that, because it doesn't strike, the language isn't the language of modern science in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm also curious though at the same time, because of course a woman can just go see her Western medical doctor. You know, it is striking that what you're talking about is a language, and I'm not here to say that it's not scientific. I mean, I don't think I'm too qualified to, you know, make pronouncements one way or the other, but it's more of a mythological language, it strikes me, when you're talking about, at least that's what's evoked for me by the moon, right? Because the moon is far away. We don't quite we've never, you know, aside from those couple astronauts, we've never been there. And yet it's this presence. And of course, it in mythical traditions, it has a power. And so, and yet there are a lot of people in the modern world, men and women, I think, particularly in the broad realm we could call psychology, like an obvious figure would be Jung, who look to myth as sort of a representation of, look, you can say this is quote unquote true in the scientific sense or not, but the fact is there's these stories that go way back. There's this continuity of human behavior that goes back hundreds or thousands of years. And so it feels like you're tapping into something that's also, you know, has a little bit of, I don't know, like more of an old world kind of.
Yeah, definitely. And I love myth. So I work a lot with that as well. So, but yeah, I think there's kind of ancestral knowledge in our bones. And, you know, I'm a woman, I'm going to say particularly in women's bones around all of this, because as I said, there were all these red tents, and like in years gone by, kind of period time wasn't so like, you know, it wasn't like seen in such disdain. It was kind of revered. It was seen as a bit of a magical time when women would be a bit more visionary and a bit more open to everything. And so, yeah, I think the moon does link back to all those old stories, but those old stories have, you know, were told for a reason, and there's often a lot we can learn from those myths. The other thing I would say, though, is that the moon impacts on water and tides, and as humans we're full of water, and particularly in pregnancy as well. A lot of women go into labour or get Braxton Hicks and things like that when there's a full moon, because it impacts on their body. And they actually have, in the UK, I know this, they have more people working on A&E wards, so accident and emergency, on a full moon, because people go a bit crazy, and that's not just women. So people are impacted by the moon, whether they kind of know it consciously or not. So there are, you know, they have more people working on A&E. People might go out and be a little bit more, you know, not dangerous, but there's an impact that the moon has on us. So whether we're male or female.
It's like a gravitational pull, just like on the ocean.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Well, it strikes me too when you talk about the red tents that if you have a community where all the women once a month go in the red tent, it's actually becomes a cycle that the men are very aware of also. It's an experience the women have that the men don't, and yet the men probably have a particular experience when the women go away, and there'd be a more just a communal sense for everyone of that cycle of and the meaning maybe of what happens every, what is it, 29 and a half days for the moon?
Yeah, it can vary. For some women, it might be 28 days. For some women, it might be 35, sometimes longer. But yeah, it's normally about that. And it is something that in my household, and kind of when I work with the women that I work with, you know, that I encourage them to talk to partners about, to kind of get that sense in the household of this cyclical nature happening. So it is something that I teach my young son about, who's 9. And basically what happens is, for me, what I've realized that I need for my bleed time is I need some time alone. So I sleep in a bed on my own, and I do less jobs. And I'm like telling everyone that, okay, I'm disappearing a bit. So sometimes what I will do is go and get some red flowers for myself and put them on the table and let everyone know that it's that time, so that their expectations can be less, because I need to be more with myself than with them. And actually my husband now, because I've been doing this for many, many, many years, he knows exactly where I am, and he'll sometimes tell me. And he's really kind of, you know, totally immersed in the whole cyclical nature, and so's my son as well, because I want my son, I mean, later when he grows up, if he decides to be with a woman, to be able to understand the changes that she's going through each month, and to be able to support her better.
Mm-hmm. It would seem like the opposite of that is just the idea that a woman's menstrual cycle is her business and not anyone else's. It's almost like a hidden thing. Let's not talk about it. And yet, if it's causing such a churning, you know, I mean, I know in my own work with clients, one of the things that I often talk about is just what is the stress of, you know, acting cheerful when you don't feel that way, or putting on a face of some kind. And we probably all unavoidably do have to do that at times, because there's always a better time and place, if, you know, but it strikes me as it makes perfect sense to sort of say, well, I know, you know, I'm not going to be my best today, and that's why I'm not going to really invite so much interaction. And yet this is not the way most of us think of it. It's just kind of like, well, you know, the
Yeah.
world keeps turning and I better keep showing up.
Yeah. But that is that's the patriarchal approach. That's the, you know, show up. It's the word actually in itself, showing up, I find a bit problematic, because it's this sense that we have to like force ourselves somehow to like do stuff when maybe we don't feel like it. So, you know, for me, it's very much about really listening to where I'm at and teaching women to be able to do that, so they can really honor themselves and be authentic and true to themselves. And this is a much more kind of feminine approach, I would say, which is much less about pushing through and doing, and actually sitting back and receiving a little bit more, which is more about this feminine aspect. So yeah, I think that it's part of the problem sometimes with a lot of issues that women get with their periods and stuff like that. It's generally because there is too much of the doing and not enough of the being part. So when we can work with this cyclical nature, then we can really kind of get in tune with when it's time to do and when it's time to be and receive. So, and that's helpful for everyone in the family. I think, going back to something you said earlier, there's also a lot of shame around periods, and a lot of women's experiences of beginning their periods started in a really shameful way. And a lot of the work that I do with women is helping to unravel that, so they can have a better relationship with themselves, their body, and their periods. And also, I think women, more so than men, have been taught from a very, very young age to people please. So there's a lot of that unraveling that has to happen as well, because in allowing yourself to follow your cyclical nature, the people pleasing has to stop. Because, you know, in that autumn winter, it's really about what do I need to honor myself and how can I give that to myself. But if you've from a young age been told that that's not a good thing to do, and you've got to put a face on, and you've got to be, you know, helping all the time other people, then that can be a really tricky thing to do. So
you mentioned girls having their first period. Is that something, have you worked with young girls as well, or do you work maybe with their mothers? It's less
yeah, I do a bit of both. I'm trained in something called Celebration Day for Girls with the amazing Jane Bennett, who's written quite a lot of books on periods and things like that. And it's what we do is we run special sessions for 10 to 12-year-old girls and their mums. So we do some work with the mums initially to kind of find out about their own period stories. And then the girls have a day with us where we tell them all about periods. We introduce them to this kind of cyclical concept. We let them ask us loads of questions that they've got about sex and periods and things like that. There's fun in there as well. We do some wonderful activities with them. And then in the afternoon, the mums come back and share their stories with their girls about how it was for them. We also talk about having women as role models and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really, really brilliant way to prepare. It's kind of a rite of passage for that journey from girlhood to womanhood. And a lot of what I do is about bringing back these rites of passage, which I think we've lost in our culture, but that are really important. We need to kind of recognize these shifts that happen. I think boys need more as well, but I work with women, but, you know, so that it's something that can be seen as, you know, not something that's shameful, not something that needs to be hidden, not something that is bad, or, you know, a lot of women get stories very early on that it's going to be painful, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. And, you know, there is a lot of that that happens, and a lot of that I unravel in the work that I do. But we can also look at some of the positive sides of it as well, and just prepare girls a little bit better for it. So yeah, I do that too.
So in terms of this other kind of strong, I don't know, energy that's out there in society about what you referred to as how that word showing up rings for you, and you don't particularly like it, which is fine. It's interesting because a lot of people really like that phrase.
Yeah.
I don't know if they make it, like it's just a sense of, because it could be the sense of, look, I'm committed, I'm available, and I showed up. But anyway, that's just anyway. Language is very interesting. But in your own story, of course, what you're doing now is not where you started. What I was reading in terms of the background you gave on your website in your teaching is, at a certain point, you had a corporate job, and then even when you began to practice and teach yoga, it was like 3 hours a day. It was like you had a very kind of a strict regimen.
Yeah.
So how did, before I, and I'm definitely curious about how you transitioned where you are, but to begin with, how do you think that more, how did that more showing up kind of phase of your life, how did that begin? Like, what made you think, this is what I'm going to do? I'm going to, really just like work at this. That seemed to be more where you were at initially.
Yeah, I think, so I was a dancer from a young age. So I'd always done movement. And then I got into yoga. And just to sort of say that the yoga that I was trained in was not like this hardcore sort of yoga that we see today. It was with Godfrey Devereux, who's an amazing teacher. And I kind of credit him for initially giving me this great foundation of yoga practice that was very much about listening to the inner body and all the subtle messages from the body. So it was very kind of inward focused yoga. He was probably in a sort of place of doing stronger stuff than where he is now. So it's even subtler now. But I think I took the yoga and then I think really it just became another thing that I used as a tool to beat myself with, probably. So, I had a really busy job. I was a project manager and I was doing the yoga on the side, and it did kind of help me have a kind of release from the day job, because it was very stressful. And it was nice having those two things, but then I think became quite separated within myself, because I was like project manager and a yoga teacher, and I had this view initially that a yoga teacher had to be and act a certain way. Like I think we all do when we first start something, and so I've got to eat this food, I've got to do this, I've got to practice this much, I've got to meditate this much. So I was taking the yoga, but still approaching it in quite a masculine, patriarchal way of, this is something that I do, rather than this is something that I am. This is something that I can fully embody and just be, whether I'm doing yoga on my mat or not. So there just came a point where I was really burnt out, because I was pushing myself at work and pushing myself at yoga. I was in quite a bad relationship at the time, and I think the yoga was a way to escape from that as well. If I just do more yoga, then I'll be all right, which worked for a bit, but then didn't. And I got quite ill. So I had to look at the yoga that I was doing and look at whether it was supporting me. And everything I was doing was producing energy that was moving out. But there wasn't really enough that was coming in and nourishing me. So
it was moving out in the sense, like, because you were teaching, that it was maybe all about the students and not feeling what was going on, or what do you mean by it was moving out?
Yeah, just that it was quite physical, quite too much yang and not enough yin, I would say. So there was too much kind of active yoga all the time, and not enough like restorative yoga or restful yoga to kind of balance that out. And I I'm a advanced restorative yoga teacher. So I kind of believe now that, you know, we can't just be doing this kind of, it was quite, it was gentle sort of vinyasa type stuff, but it was still that kind of style. And particularly when we're cyclical, we need some periods where, you know, we're just lying down on the floor and doing some yoga there. So it was kind of yoga that was trying to, quite dynamic, I would say, sort of moving yoga all the time. And I don't think personally that that's supportive. We need to have a bit of both. So it just felt like everything was activity and no rest. And I started getting loads of like womb health problems. And I went to the doctors who referred me for a scan. They did a scan and I didn't have fibroids or anything, which is what they sent me for. But what I could see was that my womb was like, there was just like loads of tension in my body that was kind of really tight tension that they didn't seem concerned about. When I saw the scan, I was like, what? So I went back home after that. I started exploring more feminine styles of yoga with Uma Dinsmore-Tooley, who teaches womb yoga and who I trained with in Well Woman Yoga Therapy. Started doing a lot of stuff with Liz Cook, with her amazing psoas work, because what I found was that my psoas was really tight as well. So I was just in this kind of fight, flight place. And then I just started completely changing the way that I approached yoga. The trainings that I'd had originally were still great, but I just needed to add other things in because, again, my teacher was brilliant, but he was still a man. He didn't understand what it was like to be in a woman's body and the cyclical nature of that. So, yeah.
So I want to come back to that comment in a moment because we were talking about it a little before we hit record, but just to kind of complete this part of your story in terms of what we spoke about at the beginning and the different sort of energies of a cycle. Is it fair to say that in the early period of your yoga practice, you were just sort of like steamrolling over all of the different, there was just no differentiation between? Okay.
Exactly that. So instead of like listening in and being like, what do I need today? I mean, I was listening in and thinking, what practice do I need? But not kind of deeply enough, not to the degree that I was even understanding I had a cyclical nature at that point. So it
was more like your yoga practice had an agenda and you were going to cover all the bases of the yoga practice.
Yeah, so today I think I need to focus on twisting or back bends or whatever, as opposed to, okay, so what's my energy like? How much, you know, maybe I should only practice for half an hour a day. Maybe, you know, maybe today I just do meditation. Maybe today I just lie down in constructive rest. So it wasn't that evolved at that point. And I think when you first start teaching yoga as well, that there can be this thing of thinking it has to be a certain way and thinking that yoga is just everything that you're doing on your mat. And I don't think it is now. You know, you can be in the supermarket and do a breathing practice in the queue, you know. So I wasn't at that point at that stage. And then the practice I was doing became unsupportive for my life and for me at that time. So, yeah.
It also strikes me that what you're talking about is applicable for men and women to understand that just because I'm in a particular yoga posture, which I can describe in terms of the shape of my body or the muscles that are engaged or any number of sort of technical, you know, movement aspects, it doesn't yet describe where I'm at in terms of my thinking or my emotion, and that's going to make a big difference. I was just following a practice this morning, listening to a recording, and it was a Feldenkrais teacher, but he had taught this whole process around, you know, connecting to the ground and movement up the spine, and there was all these different interesting shapes. But at the end of the lesson, he says, all right, now I want you to pretend that you're absolutely furious. And then, do this. It was this very odd shape that was already had been created. And then the next variation was, okay, now suppose you're depressed. And, and even made a point about, like, if you become depressed, do you also tend to sag in your spine somewhere? Or can you just, maybe you feel that way sometimes, but can you have, he was talking about depression without compression, which was kind of funny to me. But it just, again, this idea of, and I think it's almost just the nature of emotion, or the word that you used before, energy, that, you can't pinpoint it as clearly as the position of the skeleton in the posture, which everyone can point at and say, so you kind of, it seems like, for better or worse, you're kind of stuck with something that seems to exist a little bit in maybe a poetic realm, but it doesn't mean that it's not actually real part of experience. It's just, it's kind of harder for us to pinpoint and show another person exactly what it is. And
and I think I think I was running actually away from myself. The yoga was taking me further away from myself rather than closer towards, because it made me feel okay, but it was covering up a lot of things that were underneath that I needed to look at. So then eventually, obviously, the body does something to take you where you need to go. So it did. And then I had to sit and listen and kind of look at what I was doing and whether it was supporting me or not. And, in my youth, I'd done other things that were not as good for me as the yoga was, but they were still, I suppose, different addictions. I was a bit of a raver and clubbing and all of that. So,
so wait, are you describing that in terms of like your early yoga, there was almost an addiction to that form of yoga? Is that the connection?
Yeah, I think not. I think there was an addiction to the way that it made me feel. And so I wanted more of that, but I hadn't got underneath everything that needed to be addressed to kind of, the yoga that I do now, I kind of think about it more as a yoga from the inside out. The yoga I was doing then, whilst it was taught very beautifully from the inside out, started to turn into something that was more outside in.
That's interesting. I've just been reading Nature and Mind by Gregory Bateson, who's a systems thinker. And he has a whole section on addiction versus, I think it's addiction versus assimilation. And he talks about how, and he's talking about evolution, and but also, within our own lives, how we develop something, and how something often, and it might come from the outside, but we can discover something that solves a problem. But then it's that same thing that, it becomes reliant, and then at a certain point it becomes sort of irreversible, and that's what.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, and I'm sorry I didn't catch the names of all the teachers after your first teacher and you moved on, but I think I also heard you say that you went home and you made it a personal practice. Is that right, as opposed to like being practicing yoga in a classroom with others, but you had more of a personal at-home practice, or more of a self-guided kind of a situation, as opposed to?
Yeah, I mean, I always did quite a lot of practice at home, but it started to become more and more. I mean, at one point I did even do Ashtanga for a while, and this was at the stage where I would say I was, moving further away from myself. So, and I'm not really naturally a Ashtanga. So the yoga that started off quite soft did start to get more and more, harder, faster, quicker. So then I kind of, what I mean is I kind of sort of gathered all the information in and had a little pause, and then started to change my home practice so that I started really just working with the psoas for a really long time after I went to that appointment. And that was all I focused on. And then a lot of women's yoga I added in as well. So I kind of just took it right back to basics and started to really just have a beginner's mind and just look at the way that I was practicing and how I was doing it. And then kind of stripped it right back, really. Yeah. So and then got more and more into somatics and stuff. So.
So I don't know how close we are in your chronology at this point to the birth of your son, but I know that was another big moment, understandably so.
Yeah. So this happened when I'd met my husband. So yeah, I was doing all of this stuff kind of in preparation, I guess, for then getting pregnant, because after that, I started doing the women's yoga around this time as well, as a way to kind of prepare myself. I started teaching pregnancy yoga a little bit before the kind of incident happened. I think because even before I met my husband, I was teaching pregnancy yoga, but I kind of think at that point, things had started to change a little bit in me. And I was wanting to learn more. I think even though I was teaching pregnancy yoga a few years before I got pregnant, I think at that point, that's when I'd made the decision that I wanted to be pregnant. So I was sort of like preparing for that. So that kind of coincided as well with the shift that happened, because I'd been introduced to this women's yoga. And then I went on to do more of that before I got pregnant with my son. Did some more, did my well woman therapy yoga training, so that helped with my own fertility and things like that as well. And then I had my son, and while I was pregnant with my son, I trained in postnatal yoga while I was pregnant with him. So yeah, so I knew what to do afterwards as well. So yeah.
So and you work with women now who are on the whole journey around becoming pregnant, having a child. I mean, what are some of the things that, maybe not all from your story, but including the women you've worked with, what are some of the questions that come up and some of the things that you've found that need to be worked through?
Yeah, so yeah, when I say I work with women through the journey of womanhood, it's kind of, for me, these are like the key phases, like fertility and conception, and then like pregnancy, postnatal. Then there's like perimenopause and then menopause. So through all those key stages, and then menarche as well, which is when girls start their period. So I think one of the things that comes to light quite a lot, which kind of echoes my story in the pregnancy part, is that what I've found through teaching teachers and a lot of women is that if some women do have this real, if they're, I'm going to stereotype a little bit, but if people like going to the gym a lot and they are very physical and all that kind of stuff, then sometimes that transition into being pregnant can be a bit tricky, in that there is a requirement for different kind of practices. Your body requires different kind of practices.
You're going to have to give up some of that thing you do at the gym at some point.
Yeah, or give up some of that other stuff. And more that I've learned about the kind of early pregnancy period, the first trimester, from yoga perspective, from somatic movement perspective, and I've just been studying somatic psychology, the more I understand just how important that early part is, and how we need to kind of really nourish ourselves in that time and look after ourselves. Yeah, it's quite a delicate time for the body. There's a lot of miscarriages that happen in that time. It's quite a delicate time as well for baby's nervous system. Is basically the tone of their nervous system is set by, you know, the tone of mum's body. There's a big responsibility on mums, that I don't think that it's kind of fully talked about either, kind of how much, you know, baby is regulating themselves from their mum, not only in the womb, but out of the womb as well. So I think there's often a tricky transition in trying to let go of things, particularly if people have their movement practice and it is more addictive than they realize. Because maybe they've used it for their mental health or whatever, and then suddenly they can't do the thing that they were able to do because it wouldn't be safe or it doesn't feel comfortable or whatever. So that's a big thing that I think I see that as part of what a pregnancy yoga teacher has to help women with, that kind of transition of surrender and letting go, so they can come into a new place and find new practices, because that part of transition and surrender and letting go is what you have to do in labor as well. So kind of doing it in your pregnancy with other things before the baby comes is part of the process, if you like, because then a new baby is born, but a new woman is born as well. She is not like she was before. She's completely different. So it is a massive rite of passage and a big deal. So, yeah.
One obvious theme that's coming through your whole discussion of the journey of womanhood is just adaptation, the capacity to adapt.
Totally. And I think that as women, we have to, I'm probably going to say, you know, we have to do it. Everyone does, men do as well, but women go through, you know, we start periods, we end periods. There's another massive change to the body. We have babies, we heal from having babies. That's a massive change to the body. Hormone shifts in perimenopause and menopause can cause all sorts of different symptoms. So women all the time are having to, like, there's this process, this ongoing process of surrender, letting go and rebirth all the time, happening over and over again. And it's having practices that, you know, then the practices have to change again, then they have to change again, then they have to change again as we change. So for me, this whole kind of cyclical journey, it's not only monthly. I also teach a lot in line with seasons and cycles of the earth. So I teach a lot around the Celtic wheel of the year and how we've got summer solstice and autumn equinox and all of that. And so the different energies of the seasons impact us as well. And then also all these different journeys that we go through in our lives and the different stages that we're at require different practices, different approaches. So it's like a shedding and a renewal all the time. And some people find that harder to do than others.
Right. I was wondering if you ever encounter women who are really kind of skeptical about this whole approach.
Yeah. Lots of people skeptical. But then also people that maybe have been skeptical at the beginning start to work through it and then see a big change for themselves in terms of their energy, how they can support themselves better. So yeah, there's lots of skeptical people, but all I kind of just teach from my lived experience. So this has worked for me and this is what I teach. But I think that there's a lot more now conversation happening about periods. I know in the UK, some companies have started giving period leave for women. There's a lot more talk in the UK, at least I know, about menopause. There's been some programs on TV about menopause and all the issues that women go through and how they should be supported more within the workplace and all that kind of stuff. I did a program with Julie Etchingham that I was featured in. We did a little bit of a yoga class on there. So I think that things are starting to change, but yeah, there's still a lot of skepticism. Yeah. So,
okay, so then maybe this is a good time we can come back to that comment. Before we hit record, you were telling me about something that's been going on in the yoga world. That so there was a training organized, I guess, for male yoga teachers to work more, who work with women. And
I saw something in a yoga teacher group with some women I know who do a lot of great work with women's yoga, perimenopause, a lot of work with like pelvis and all this kind of good stuff. And they were advertising to say, guys, yoga teacher guys, we want you to come to these sessions to learn more about women's bodies, to learn more about menstrual cycles, to learn more about perimenopause and menopause, so that you can better support the women coming to your classes. And what I noticed was that a couple of men had like commented, and immediately it was coming back to, well, what about how women teach men in yoga classes and how they refer to different parts of the anatomy and things like that. And I totally get that that's really, really important too, and that whoever's coming to class, we need to help them to feel included. And when I'm talking about women's yoga, I'm also talking about people that identify as women as well. So, you know, they're all welcome in my classes. So there's that aspect. But it just seems strange to me that there was quite a lot of defensiveness happening. And with so many women doing yoga, and we know that the majority of people doing yoga are women, it seems strange to me that men don't want to understand women's bodies better so that they can better support women. And in my experience, there's not that many male teachers who kind of talk about this cyclical nature. Some of them might talk more about, you know, earth and seasons and that type of thing. But I think it's important, if you're working with women, that you understand that as a personal trainer, as whoever, because if you were training someone, say it was a personal trainer, and trying to give them the same thing every week, that's not going to be helpful. So, so at the simplest level, there's that. But then at another level, it's kind of understanding all the different hormonal shifts and all the symptoms and things that can bring up. You know, women in perimenopause and menopause can get more asthma, can get more histamine issues, can get tinnitus, can get loads of different things. And I think that if you're working with women a lot, you need to kind of know. But
well, you know, it's interesting, this what you're referring to is this defensiveness that comes up with some of, at least some of the comments that you saw. And yet it can be really difficult in all kinds of situations to understand clearly that, wow, I might be really ignorant about a topic, and yet to want to go into that place and engage, it makes you very vulnerable, right? And some people maybe have more capacity for that. I mean, again, just thinking back to where we began, and we were talking about the red tents, and that thing that just came to me, like, well, gosh, all the men are going to see the women going into the red tents, whereas it sounds like, you know, just in terms of that that lineage, what you're doing, and I know there's other women doing this, and I know that this is, let's just say, more of a thing than it probably was 10, 20, 30 years ago. I think that the kind of work you're doing is becoming more known in the world.
Yeah, definitely.
But it would seem like, you know, this is a challenging thing. I mean, I was also really kind of curious to hear more about what you said about talking with your son or talking with your husband, because there is a way that you can educate and you can, you know, but a lot of what you're talking about, I'm never going to really know, right? So what is it that we need from those who don't have our experience? And how can we communicate in such a way that we can get the, you know, the proper respect on both sides for the difference of the experience, but without it becoming a source of new conflict? It seems like a tricky thing. I mean, obviously we could take this broader because there's so much discussion in the world today about so many things, you know, that historically feel imbalanced in one way or another. And yet, you know, you really need a dialogue with two sides to resolve these things.
Well, I think my starting point might have been, there's an amazing book called Wild Power by Alexandra Pope and Shanae Wirtz. I can't remember how to pronounce her surname, but they wrote this book, and there's a section in the back that is especially for men to read. So they kind of wrote this section for men. So I think I gave that to my husband to read. But I think I just started talking about this pretty early on, really, in our relationship, and just started talking about how I charted, and he was interested. So I told him more, and we would like sync our diaries a little bit as well. So, you know, when we were thinking about whether we were going to go places and stuff like that, he would sort of say, oh no, you're going to be on your bleed then, so you won't want to go. So, you know, it just became like I think over time, he just got to understand my cyclical nature more by simply observing and me talking about it and sharing with him how it worked for me, what I experienced. And then I started just to talk to my son about it as well. When we would talk about, my son's been quite inquisitive generally about sex and things like that and how stuff works. I think because I'm a doula and I was popping off to births, he was sort of quite inquisitive early on about how babies came along and stuff. So I think just as I've been talking to him about all that sort of thing, I've been just gradually adding things in about seasons and stuff. I think probably a difference in my house as well is that I work a lot with seasons and cycles energy anyway, like the Celtic Wheel of the Year. So as a family, we will often do things around that, like little rituals around, oh, we're in spring now. Oh, we're in summer, we're in autumn. How do we acknowledge that? And so he gets that model of the season. So then when I'm applying it to how it works in a woman's body, it's like, oh yeah, I get that. I know what those seasons mean. So yeah, that seemed to be quite simple for him to get and understand.
So in other words, you've given him the opportunity to have, obviously not your experience, but some kind of felt experience that he can refer to in his own, you know, in his body, in his memory, something that he can relate to as a reference.
Yeah, so when it's spring equinox or autumn equinox or winter solstice, we will do a little family ritual around that. We will talk about what winter's like for him, how he knows it's winter. He went to a Steiner kindergarten school where they really focused a lot on that type of thing as well, like seasons and how the seasons are energetically, and, you know, how nature grows and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's the sort of starting point. You start there wider, and then you kind of bring it in closer, because it's the same thing that's happening, but it's just happening inside a woman's body as what's happening outside in the world. So.
You used another word that I'm also curious about, and also in context of, I guess, modern life, let's just say, which is the word ritual.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if your family rituals are based on, you know, other ritual that you're aware of, but, you know, in modern life, ritual, if we have ritual, to some degree, we're inventing it, because it's not like, you know, unless you happen to already, like for your son, maybe it wouldn't be so invented because he received it growing up, and if he became an adult who had similar rituals. But for many people this day and age, you know, to participate in ritual, again, there's just that gap of like, what, you know, and then you have to get past that. So what's, I guess, two-part question is, you know, what is the value of ritual? And then secondly, like, how do you sort of begin from scratch with
Yeah.
ritual?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think for me, with the whole, when I started moving more just from my cycle into like the Celtic wheel of the year, for me, there was a framework there already. And for me, as a yoga teacher, I went to India as well. And I think I used to try, initially, I was doing a lot of the sort of rituals that I learned there, like getting up in the morning, doing that early morning practice and all that kind of stuff. But what I realized was that it's really hot in India. So they do that. But for me, living in England, it was like really pitch black in the morning. It wasn't helping my circadian rhythms. And so those rituals weren't really for my like little Celtic body. So I started to explore more the Celtic Wheel of the Year, which felt more like it was coming from my ancestral lineage, because I'm from the UK. You know, so it seemed like rituals that were closer to home for me. So I started kind of adding all of this into my yoga practice because it felt like it was more authentic to me to be following this kind of Celtic calendar. And it resonated for me. And it was something that I could just really be with through the whole of the year, observing the seasons. So I started running workshops for women around the seasons to start with, so that we could observe this together. And it felt to me like just adding these lovely little reflective pauses in at key points in the year. So you could really recognize, okay, so what has my journey been like from winter solstice to the spring? What might I want to bring in now in this next part of the calendar? So it was really, for me, it feels just like being able to be a bit more intentional with things, with what I might want to plant seeds of in the world, but also taking time to really take stock of what had happened, the journey that you've been on, which I don't think we do very much. We're just like on to the next thing, on to the next thing. And there's never like a little pause and a reflect. So it started out as a way to really connect with the landscape, I think, and the earth. And then I started to research more kind of rituals that people used to do years ago. So there's a woman that I love called Glennie Kindred, who's written a lot of books. So I would gather a lot of information from her. I would see what came out of me as things that I wanted to do myself. So some of the rituals were kind of handed down from ancestors that I would adopt. And some of them would be things that I would create around the ideas that I got from these books and things. But it did give me this sense of, I don't know, more of a sense of belonging, I think, to the landscape, more of a sense of really noticing what was going on. And I ran a course once for a whole year where we went through all the seasons together with one group, and we would find a place, or we found a place out in nature that we would keep visiting over and over again, so we could see the seasonal shifts through the whole of that year. And there was something pretty magical about that as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, if I waffled, but
well, yeah, so it seems like for you it was important that you weren't just inventing from cloth, we say. You found a historical reference, and then, but it also does seem like, you know, without going into the details of the Celtic calendar, it sounds like there's some very basic elements of just setting aside time, of being with others, of some sort of repeated experience that, because there's been a passage of time, there's a way to compare one to the other. And it's just, it just allows for that, those maybe, because there's all kind of, like, we've all visited a friend of ours, and their child, you know, who we haven't seen for 2 years, is like, you know, this giant all of a sudden. but sometimes we don't see how that happens.
Yes.
But that's what I'm hearing with you.
Yeah. Definitely, it's like having a wider lens. And the whole thing about the cycles, for me, it's like macro to micro, micro to macro. Everything in nature, everything in life is cyclical. So it's tapping into that, but it's also being a bit more, what's the word? Taking time to notice, like slowing down. It helped me slow down, I think. Approaching life in this way, it's really helped me slow down, helped me to really like be present more, to really observe what's going on, and to cultivate more gratitude as well. That's a big part often of these rituals, is kind of being really grateful for what's happened. Or they used to do it around harvest time, so you'd be grateful for the grain that you got from the land and all of that kind of stuff. And then being able to take all of that and share that with a group of women, because I run a lot of moon circles and things as well, it was clear to me that this was something that was needed, actually. That this coming together, particularly when we did this year course, we would meet about every 6 weeks. And it was such a lovely thing just to take a little pause from life, have a look around, and then share the experience with each other as well. So yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about the somatic psychology, which you've become more interested in?
Yeah. So I think the yoga that I was doing was becoming more and more woman focused, and I did the Well Woman Yoga Therapy, and then I started about several years ago now to also start to explore more somatic movement with a teacher of mine called Fabiano, who's great. I met him in Leeds.
And can I stop you right there just to say that somatic is a word that's, I guess, entering a little more of the mainstream, but it could mean a lot. So what, without putting you on the spot to define it for all time, what particularly does that mean for you? Because you were a yogi for quite some time before you then talked about a somatic approach.
Yeah. I think my introduction into a more somatic approach probably came a bit before Fabiano, because one of my main teachers is Angela Farmer, and she has a very feminine somatic approach to yoga. And by that, I mean an inner body approach. So her yoga approach is very much more about how things feel and less about what things look like. And it's quite feminine. So less linear approach to poses and more kind of circles and spirals, things like that. I suppose it's a bit similar to a kind of Scaravelli approach to yoga. So inner body focus. So I started doing much more of that. And then Fabiano, I met him, and he's a somatic movement therapist. And he also teaches at a dance college, a lot of students there more around the somatic side of things. And what somatic means to me is just of the body, more inner body, as opposed to felt sense of things.
But then psychology would seem to be of the mind. So somatic psychology, is it kind of a blending, or where they meet?
Bringing together of the two, yeah. So the course that I've just done is a course that comes from Linda Hartley and her experience. So she trained a lot in body-mind centering, and then also has a psychology background as well. So she's a psychotherapist too. So she kind of has blended the two together. I think she studied in some body psychotherapy as well. So when I did this course, it was kind of because I work quite therapeutically with women anyway, one-to-one, but it was sort of bringing together the sort of two aspects of what I do, that because I already do a lot of somatic movement in the practices that I do, and Feldenkrais with you. And but I wanted to kind of get underneath it all and find out more about the psychology aspect. So in this course, we kind of go through the whole journey from birth. So what's going on when you're in the womb to when you're born, and there's lots of different models that we use that we can then use in therapeutic sessions with our clients, but everything's done in a really embodied way. So you're in the womb, basically back in the womb, seeing what that's like, what it's like to be attached to an umbilical cord, what it's like to go through the birth canal, and all of that.
So you've revisited that recently.
Yeah.
What was that like for you? Did you have any personal insights that came from that?
Yeah, there was a lot of epiphanies for me. And what I've learned from the course is really just more about myself and my patterns that have been established through my life, and how my womb life was for me, how my life as a child was for me, and the sort of attachments that I have with my parents, and how that's impacted on me as a person, how that impacts on how I am in relationship now. So it was pretty mind-blowing. And there was a lot to process, and it wasn't supposed to be an online course. It was meant to be face-to-face, but because of the pandemic, I'm pretty amazed that we managed to do all of this material online, which was a lot for us. And there was a lot of processing that went on in between times. But it just kind of filled the gap in for me, I think, of, a lot of movement is based around early developmental movement patterns. So, when you can understand those more, you can start to get a sense of what a person might need more or less of, and what pattern they might be stuck in, perhaps. So learning more about all of that kind of stuff. And then lots of kind of theoretical models that you can use with clients. We did a lot of work around trauma as well. So how you could support students with trauma too. So that, if you're working with someone and they get triggered in some way, how you can help them to process that energy in the time that you're with them. So, yeah.
So it seems like a connecting of someone's movement practice to their personal history in a more kind of maybe not precise way, but a more intentional way at the very least.
Yeah, but also kind of, I don't know, sometimes people can get stuck in particular channels as well. So some of what we were learning was around process work, Arnold Mindell's work. So, you might meet with a client and they're very verbal. They're always very verbal. So your job might be to try and shift them into a different place. So you can get them more into their body, or you can get them more into a visual place, because often if something needs to shift or move, it's because perspective needs to change. And you work a lot around perspective. So it's kind of having tools and little models that you can use and refer back to that can enable you to help that person kind of get a bit unstuck from where they're at and move into a different place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. When you were talking just now, and also earlier, what you were describing with the courses you've run and the moon circles, it also strikes me that, you can offer a group class and it has just a certain, there's almost a certain convenience of group classes and whatnot, but it seems like the other students in the class is part of what the class offers, that there's this kind of, there's this awareness of the role of community, or even studying the process of relationship. And I don't know if I'm hearing this right, but it seems like in the somatic psychology work, at least some of the examples you just gave, might be more of a one-on-one kind of situation. But I'm curious, since you do both, you work in groups and you work with individuals, because one of the things that I've thought about recently is that, you know, whether it's yoga or Feldenkrais or meditation, there's a lot of wonderful practices that we can do for ourselves. And yet, if that is the only form our practice takes,
yeah,
it's bound to run into a certain limitation. It's like, oh my God, let me run home and meditate. And then, you know, and we can't always do that.
yeah.
So I'm just curious for you, you know, how you've blended the individual and the group approaches.
Yeah, I think a big part of what I do, relationship to me is important. And I think because I do the work that can take you through from, like, you know, menarche, fertility through to menopause, sometimes I work with women over a long period of time through different kind of phases of their lives. And that might not be constant support. They might dip in and dip out when they need me. But it's that ability to build relationships with people. That's what I like. That's what I enjoy. And as a doula, that's what you're doing as well, you know, supporting someone through the whole of their pregnancy potentially, and then birth and postnatally. But another big part of what I enjoy is building community. And I would say that I run most of my sessions on the basis of like a circle. So, you know, like women's circles. I run women's circles, and a lot of my workshops and things will be taught in a circular way. We'll even sit in a circle. We won't sit with mats in straight lines, so that it's a circle and we're connected. And everybody coming and joining in that circle is an integral part of what makes the event what it is, of what makes the session what it is, because we're all an important part of that circle that's being created. And what I've learned more and more, I think, through the somatic psychology is just how much is going on in the field within, you know, with two people working together or within a group, and how everyone is like, you know, this like soup that's getting mixed up, and we're all regulating from each other. So, you know, whenever we're in a group environment, we're all impacting on each other at whatever level anyway. So yeah, community and this kind of circle approach is really important to me. And I think it's very powerful as well. When women come together, that's who I work with, in circle, like magical things happen. There's a lot of shared experience that can be shared amongst the group, and then people realize that other people are having the same experience, you know. And so there's an extra sense of belonging that can come from that I think is sometimes missing in our modern worlds, where we are more and more expected to just be these solo people without, you know, the community support. And particularly I find that with new mums, you know, that mums need a village, and they don't have that village anymore. So in a lot of what I'm doing, we're trying to, in a way, create that in some way so that women can feel that support again.
Right. Just that last point, I mean, it strikes me that, you know, one of the ideas that came out of women's liberation is that women aren't going to stay at home, and, you know, they're going to have a career. And that's perfectly understandable why that's can be a positive change. And yet there's also, if it becomes, well, I'm doing that and I'm doing everything else around the family, or, you know, I mean, here's maybe an interesting question for you, because it kind of circles back to some of what we were talking about between men and women before, which is that, you know, there's an obvious discussion to be had around equality and everyone having, but it sounds like, you know, a big piece of your work is also being very clear that it's not the same experience, you know, and respecting that, you know. So it seems like, you know, if we think of equality in terms of math and an equals sign, it might be a little too crude a way of thinking about, you know, so I'm curious about that. And you know, you've already talked about. I mean, it would seem that the one obvious thing about something like one of your moon circles is, you know, if women are facing challenges in their lives related to the men in their lives, well, those men aren't present in that moment, so they get to experience, even if temporarily, not having that stress. But, you know, again, we all do. We don't have like one hemisphere of the globe for men and one for women, so we do have to come back together.
Yeah. But I think that sometimes just being able to have that little bit of space away with other women who understand what you're going through is sometimes enough. You know, sometimes that might be all it takes. I do think that in the pandemic, I'll have a little rant, that women like really had the brunt of stuff. That's the experience that I've heard about and seen in the UK anyway, you know, that, you know, we did have women and men both working. That is how it is in a lot of cases. And yet there were children off school, and somehow the women seem to still have to do more of the caretaking, even though everyone was at home, or sometimes men were still going to an office somewhere or whatever. So the women not only had to do their day job, but they had to look after babies and stuff as well, which, you know, I get quite angry about. So there is still that disparity, I think, that's happening. But yeah, I think it's not an equal sign, like you say. I think that what women need is different to what men need. But I do think that more men's circles would be beneficial for men as well. But whether they'd go to them is another thing.
Right. Well, yeah. And that was another thing you mentioned before. Have you talked with any men who are involved in some kind of, you know, exclusively men's work, just to compare notes? Have you ever had those dialogues?
I haven't, but there are some that I kind of refer people to that look really good. There's some good groups in the UK where men are doing quite some good work around this. I can't remember who they are off the top of my head, but I can definitely share some info. Kind of rites of passage stuff. There's some things I've looked at for my boy, you know, for when he becomes 13, that he can do with his dad. So I think there is a need for it with men as well. And, you know, there's a lot of men and young boys who commit suicide, like more so than women. So I think there's definitely a need for it, but there is also a stigma attached to it somehow.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. Well, again, if women are going to transform their lives, like it or not, every man who knows who's part of the personal life gets affected too. There is this relationship, and
yeah, totally.
you know, this too, you know, I've run into in working with clients, both men and women, but it's like, I'm ready for change, but my partner isn't, you know, yeah. And that can be a real difficult question, because, you know, sometimes it poses the question like, is my personal transformation what's most important, or is this relationship, which might be a long-term one?
Yeah.
You know, and yeah. I don't know if this is a experience that you've had with your clients. I'm imagining you might have found yourself in that situation before.
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes it's not a linear process either. And I think that happens in relationships, that sometimes there might be this point where you're a bit further away and then you're coming back together. And sometimes you might have someone who's in one place and sometimes in another. I'm not sure there's an answer for it. I think it's just a little dance that happens in relationship. And then it might change again, where they're the person going through the big change and you're in a different space. Mm-hmm. Maybe if everyone was changing at the same time, that might be a bit much anyway.
That's also true. But in other words, I guess what I'm saying is, you know, if you have a man and a woman in a relationship, or two men or two women, or whatever the case may be, but you have a relationship, as soon as one of those people changes, the relationship has already
Oh yeah,
changed. You
totally.
cannot,
Yeah, that's changed.
right. So
But then they
go ahead.
might spend a bit of time, like the other person might have to get used to that for a bit and then
Right.
play a little bit of catch up.
Right.
Is my experience. Yeah, it does happen. And sometimes it happens where that change is too much for the other person to deal with and there's a breakup or whatever. But that hasn't happened so much in my experience. There's been maybe a little bit of, you know, kind of shift in the water and getting to know each other again. But then are sort of coming back together. So yeah, I mean, it can change in people.
Right. But would this be a piece of what you would talk to your clients about? You know, like you're going through this program, and then you're going to go back into your household, and
yes,
that a piece of what you help them with?
Yeah, sometimes, and sometimes I work quite a lot with couples, particularly in the pregnancy process. So I do a lot of birth prep workshops with couples. And I do sometimes some fear release sessions with couples. So more so in the pregnancy, that kind of aspect's added in. But it's a really good point, and maybe something I need to think about in the other areas too. But definitely in the pregnancy, we do a lot of work with couples too, and with birth preparation for both mum and dad together, so that dads can be like a doula,
right,
for their partners.
So let's talk a little bit about that too, because doula, like the word somatic, I mean, it's people have heard of doulas at this point, but let's just guess there may be some people scratching their heads every time you say that word. So what's your doula work?
Yeah, so doula means to mother the mother, basically. It's a Greek word. I'm not doing so much of it at the moment because I've just moved to France and I kind of need to understand the French birthing system a little bit more, get my language up to speed. But yeah, so with the doula work, I do quite a lot of work, doula work, virtually. So not actually coming to your birth, but sort of being like that support on hand that you can contact and work with virtually online, or even in France. So it means to mother the mother, but I'm there to mother the partner as well. So normally we would meet together. I'd talk about what your birth wishes might be, so how you want your birth to look and feel and that kind of thing, what my role might be to support you in that. So sometimes, you know, people might have another child that they want to be at the birth and they want me to look after the child. They might want me to be more present for them. They might be having a hospital birth and have decided to have a C-section. Maybe the father or mother, if it's a same-sex couple, don't want to be in the operating theatre because they hate that. I might step in for them and be there supporting. So I support all sorts of births, hospital, home, whatever you choose. And I'm there really to provide you with information if you want to research what your choices are for birth. I'm there to find out what you want your birth to look like, and then I'm kind of a gatekeeper for that. So I take your birth preferences, and when we're in the hospital or at home, when the midwife arrives, I give them this guide as to what your preferences are. And as much as possible, I try and kind of, I'm the gatekeeper of that for you. So if things are suggested that need to happen in your labor, I would help to create some space for you to be able to think about what you want to do with your partner, and, you know, manage the kind of relationship with the midwife a little bit, helping to support you. And then I help support after the birth and in the early stages of being a new mum, when you've got a zillion questions and you've got this baby and you don't know what to do with it. So that's kind of the work there. But I'm at the birth as well. So I'm kind of there for before, in preparation for, I'm there during, and I'm there after. As a virtual doula, I kind of do all the stuff before, but I wouldn't be there at your birth. So, yeah.
Do you find that when you're involved with couples who are having a birth in a hospital, are you often kind of intervening on their behalf? I mean, I think that, for people who don't work with a doula, who maybe don't consider a lot of the questions we've been talking about in this conversation, there's a way that, pregnancy and birth and even raising a baby for the first couple of years, it's like, I know the experience that I had when my daughter was born was largely like, we kept sort of consulting the experts. But like, one thing was for sure, we weren't the experts, right? It was always like, you need to buy a book to learn how it's done. The nurses at the hospital were giving us very, specific instructions about feeding times and stuff, which later, we kind of figured out, like, that was a number that you mentioned, but it doesn't seem to be what our daughter is, it doesn't seem to correspond to her sense of time. And, and I'm not to necessarily say that there's no value provided by, modern medicine around this, but your whole approach that you've been discussing is very different. So I'm just wondering, I'm sure you have things to say about.
Yeah. Okay. So where to start? Yeah, I think that birth has been kind of medicalized. I'd say probably a little bit different in the UK to the US. Perhaps not quite as medicalized in the UK. So, however, part of my role, if I was a doula in hospital, would be, because often women are put on a kind of time limit when they're in hospital, mainly because, resources are low and all of that kind of thing. So it's really trying to figure out if there are, if certain things are recommended to mum in labour, is it because it really has to happen right now, or is it just that you'd like things to be a little bit faster?
Right, move along the assembly line to the next.
Yeah, so I think that having a doula there can sometimes change that immediately, because the midwives and the caregivers know that there's another person there. So that in itself can sometimes change how things operate in the birthing room. But I wouldn't kind of get involved. I'm not making decisions for the birthing couple, but I might just create some space so the information that's gathered can be delivered to the mum and dad, so they can then make the choice that they want to make without feeling that they've been coerced into making that choice. Because, for example, women are often offered vaginal internal exams. Now, the more of those you have, the more risk there is of infection. And it is a way of finding out how dilated you are. But there are other ways of finding out how dilated you are. Like, there's sometimes a line that goes up the bum, like a purple line. You can look at breathing. You can kind of see how deeply into themselves they might have gone. So it's kind of like, but often women might continually be asked, do you want this? Do you want this? Even though they've said, no, they don't want this. So then it's kind of a line between, are you offering, or now is it kind of moving more into coercion? So part of what I do is just sort of make sure that mum really wants to do that or not.
Right. It's about getting safety,
decision making. So is it okay if the midwife might leave the room for a moment, or we all leave the room and leave mum and dad to make a decision, so that so that they're making decisions that they want to make, that are done on the basis of informed consent. So often, suggestions might be made in labour as well, but are the mum and dad given the pros for that as well as the cons, or are they just told this is what you need to do? So if they're given the pros and the cons, then they can make a choice about what they want. So I'm really all about just making sure people have got the information so they can make their own decision, but it's an informed one as well. So yeah, my personal preference, I'm not going to lie, is home births. That's my personal preference, but I will assist at any. So, and I had a home birth myself, so you know that's my own experience. And to be honest, when I first started going into hospital as a doula, I was I didn't really know what to expect because I'd had a home birth. So it was a little bit of a rude awakening for me the first time because it was very different to my own experience. So yeah.
I mean, and I think this is just another area where I have so little information that I might be totally off base here, but my sense, at least in the world today, is that to have a home birth is actually a much bigger production. It would be a lot simpler to go to the hospital, but maybe I'm wrong about that in some key ways. I mean, do you find that women are would that be a really big step for someone to decide to do the home birth?
I think for some people it would be a big step, but it depends. You need to birth in a place where your body feels safe. And for me, I don't like hospitals. I'm not a big fan of hospitals. My body feels safe at home. So for me, actually birthing in a hospital would not have been the best place for me. So I think fundamentally it comes down to that. Where do you feel safest to birth? But I think research in the UK, anyway, at least, showed that there's less intervention that happens when women birth at home. Mm-hmm. So it is actually, it's seen as in media and stuff, you often read headlines about it not being safe, but statistically, at least in the UK, it is safer to birth at home in terms of not going into, you know, lots of intervention. And you don't need much stuff to birth at home either. It can be very simple. We hired a birth pool, but you don't need to. You just have the bath. But yeah, but I think it you know, particularly in pandemic times as well, a lot of people might have thought it was a safer place to birth. Mm-hmm. And the issue during the pandemic, at least in the UK, was that, you know, many women were having to birth completely alone in the pandemic, completely alone, not even with their partner. And even now in the UK, like people, I was a bit livid about this the other week, 40,000 people could go and watch the football, okay? But you still can't have an extra person with you in the birthing suite other than your partner. Mm-hmm. So another example of patriarchy at its best.
In the previous podcast I did, I was talking to a dancer and artist named Vinny Wano, who happens to be a new father, and his son was born during the pandemic, and he was talking about how, you know, all the people who wanted to come and hold the baby and they couldn't come. Yeah. And it'll be really interesting, but just we can't even begin to wonder about the impact. I'm sure for you, having, especially with the somatic psychology that you've just been, you know, diving into and everything. This whole time period, hopefully we can say that it comes to an end at some point, but it's going to reverberate, and I'm almost getting a new sense of that just in our discussion from all the perspective you're giving me in terms of these different levels of connection.
It's definitely brought home for me doing the course in the pandemic and learning what I learned, you know, how different the experience of birth would have been for women in the pandemic without that support, without the support of the village afterwards as well, and all the lockdown and everything else, and what that will have done to somebody's psyche, you know, to their body, to their soul really as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of reverberation, like you say, from these times. And, you know, what was the impact like for baby in the womb as well, in these pandemic times as well? So there's that aspect too. But now I think that things are opening up. Then, you know, in the UK, people can go to the pub. You need to let there be another person in the birthing ward with mum and dad. You can go to the pub with your mates. Surely that there can be another person in the labour ward with you. So,
right.
you know.
It's a weird moment right now. I mean, here in my neighborhood, anyways, you know, I mean, majority of people no longer wear masks, and yet it's really unclear. And anyway, this is probably another whole podcast conversation that could happen. We've covered a lot of ground already, but maybe as we wrap up, I'm just curious. You already talked about where you're at in life, and specifically where you're at in your journey as a woman in life right now. And then I think of it just because of this experience of the pandemic that we've all been going through. But I'm just curious, apart from all your teaching, what does your personal practice look like right now in terms of what you're doing on an ongoing basis for yourself?
Yeah, so I've just done a breath course actually, which was all about kind of trauma-informed and somatic breathing. And really it was taking a lot of the traditional yoga breathing techniques, but really stripping them back to make them, to kind of undo the doing aspect of it. So they're really subtle and kind of less forced, shall we say. And my breathing has just completely changed. I've recognized a lot of habits and patterns that I had. So I've found that really helpful, particularly in these times, learning how to breathe better and learning how to stop breathing through my mouth and things like that, but also kind of to let go of the conditioning that was there to push and pull the breath as well. So that's a big part of my practice at the moment, is just breathing, authentic movement, Feldenkrais, and then my kind of style of yoga. So for me, I like having a mix of different things to pull on. I'm the sort of person that would get really bored if I was just doing one approach all the time. So I like to just see how I am on a particular day and what I might need to give myself. I do a lot of restorative yoga as well. So in a day, there'd be at least 20 minutes of rest every day, just lying down, doing nothing. So that's important.
With all the different things that you're involved in, and it almost sounds like part of your ongoing practice is learning and continuing to expand. But to fit it all in, is it safe to say that the menstrual cycle is still sort of what organizes all of it for you? Is that become
that's
kind of the anchor?
Yeah, that's just like part of me now, like charting and recognizing where I'm at. That's just me. That's my life, really, working in that way. And then the practices that I do fit around that. So they're very much based on, you know, where I am in my cycle. Then the practices would be different depending on where I'm at. So definitely in winter, it would be more of the restorative, maybe more Feldenkrais as well, because a lot of that's lying down. And then in spring, summer, I might do a bit more dancing, authentic movement, and maybe more kind of dynamic yoga in that phase. So it's definitely around this kind of cyclical nature of mine. But I like being able to pull on different things. And then a lot of my practice is also, you know, trying to keep my cool when I'm with my kid and he's like kicking off.
Sure. I'm sure all parents can relate to
That's part of my practice as well, and kind of being in relationship with others and staying present. And so I kind of see like some things are things I do on my mat, and some things are things I'm doing all the time, orienting to where I am. So I think the more you practice and the older you get, the more those sort of lines blur a bit. I'd say the main focus for me at the moment in perimenopause, though, is pleasure. I want a load of pleasure. I want space and pleasure. So that's a bigger part of my practice as well, which probably comes back to where we started with this showing up. So there's this thing in perimenopause, menopause, where it's kind of like women are pulled to something within them that seems a bit more important than everything that's going out there. So then that kind of showing up feels like, well, actually, I'm showing up, but I'm showing up for me, and I want to go and sit in the garden and look at the birds for an hour.
Mhm.
So pleasure, seeking
Yeah.
pleasure, that's a big practice for me.
Yeah, great. Well, obviously, since I can never share your experience in terms of biology, I can draw certain lessons. But one of the things that really I love about what you've told me today is just this idea that a cycle, and let's just talk about more generally any kind of a cycle, but to have a cycle kind of to organize things, it does actually provide a container where you can have more variety to the experience without having what I think is a very common kind of pitfall in this day and age, which is like I'm pulled in too many different directions, right? I'm or even just because I'm fascinated by so many things, but there's more than I can do. But
Yeah.
to know that I'm going to hit this one and then that one, but then eventually I'm going to come back around this, I haven't abandoned this one activity because I will circle back.
Yeah. I think it's this thing that we can, if we want to, if we get into a rhythm or a pattern, which is good, we might think we're falling off the wagon if we stop doing that thing, but maybe we're not. We're just like, oh, I've moved into wanting and needing this now, and then I'll come back to that thing when I'm ready again. So it's not that we've forgotten about it and that we're not using it and we're not disciplined, but we're in a different place and we need something else. And I think that applies to our lives as well. Like sometimes we're in more of a contraction in our lives, sometimes we're in more of a creative kind of doing outward space, and that applies, I think, to men as well. We'll be in different places in our lives, and it's about recognizing that and going with it and not trying to fight it. So.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, before we go, could you just tell people who are listening if they would like to be in touch with you and learn more specifically, maybe connect and work with you? How can they do that?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on social media. I'm mainly on Facebook and Instagram, and my tag is @weareallwoman. My website is all-woman.co.uk. And I also have a personal website, Lara Heppell, so you can find me on there as well.
Great. Okay, so we'll put that all in the description of the YouTube video. And I'll just say, I haven't said this on the podcast before, but it's going to also show up on Apple and Spotify and some of those places too. So just a little organizational announcement here on the end of our conversation. I don't know, we've talked about so much. Is there any kind of final thoughts or things that you just want to get out there that you didn't say already?
No, I think I said a lot. I would say that if you're a man watching this, maybe just see if you can learn a little bit, because I think the more you can understand the cyclical nature of your partner, the better that can help you in your relationships together, because then you can kind of recognize when your partner might need a bit more receiving and a bit more support from you, and when she might be able to give you a little bit more. So I think it can be really helpful from that perspective as well, and in parenting too. So if you're sharing parenting, you can help each other more. So yeah.
And if there's any women who are listening who are new to the perspective that you're talking about, what's the final word for them?
If you're a woman listening and you're interested in charting your cycle and cycle awareness, then get in touch. I would say there's loads of blogs on my website as a starting point, as a way in. If this is something you've listened, you think, yeah, that resonates with me, maybe have a look at the blogs as a little starting point, as a way in. And even if I would say if you're really resistant to it, then explore it as well, because often resistance is telling you that there's like something in this that actually. Maybe needs a bit more exploring. That too.
Great. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Lara. I'm glad we
Yeah, it has. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, enjoy the rest of your day and
Thanks.
take care. Okay.
See you. Bye.